You weren't manipulated despite your sensitivity. You were manipulated because of it. And deep down, you already knew that. You're alone. The room is quiet. You've just realized that everything you thought you were experiencing for months wasn't what you believed. Not the relationship you had built in your mind. Not the person you thought you saw. You were manipulated. And what's crushing you right now isn't the other person's betrayal. It's the realization that you let it happen, that you saw the signs, and that you chose, again and again, to erase them. Because seeing would have required change, and the illusion was more comfortable than the truth. Carl Jung gave this mechanism a name with unsettling precision: projection. Human beings never really see others as they are. They first see what they place onto them. Their ideals, their hopes, sometimes their oldest wounds. And for an empath, this projection carries a particular intensity because they don't project just anything. They project their own inner light, their ability to feel, to understand, to heal. And that light, placed in the wrong direction, becomes a weakness. It doesn't reveal the other person. It blinds you to them. You've always felt things more deeply than others. This ability to sense what someone is going through before they even say a word. You've carried it as a strength. But no one ever taught you that it could also become a vulnerability. When you feel this deeply, it's hard to imagine that depth could be used against you. So, you don't ignore the signs. You downplay them. Then something broke. Not in an argument, not in some dramatic revelation. Quietly, like a certainty you thought was solid, starting to crack. And with it comes a question that's more unsettling than the betrayal itself. What in me made this possible? Carl Jung would answer without hesitation. Look at your shadow. Look at the savior archetype you embody without even realizing it. The part of you that believes love alone can transform someone. Look at the mask you wear to be loved, to be accepted, to feel indispensable. This isn't an accusation, it's a map. And that map, precise, structured, built on decades of clinical observation, is exactly what this video is going to help you move through. You're not going to learn how to distrust others. You're not going to become colder or more closed off. You're going to understand, maybe for the first time with real depth, what actually happened inside you. And that understanding, Carl Jung would have called the beginning of something rare and demanding, the beginning of individuation, the exact moment when you stop being a victim of your projections and become conscious of yourself. The love you never actually gave. Before understanding how you were manipulated, you need to accept a truth most empaths refuse to fully face. You didn't love the person who manipulated you. Not really. You loved what you projected onto them. And that distinction, as harsh as it may sound at first, is actually the starting point of any real understanding of what you went through. Because as long as you believe you loved the real person, you won't be able to grasp what truly happened inside you. Carl Jung devoted a large part of his work to the mechanism of projection. What he observed over decades of clinical practice is strikingly precise. Human beings never perceive others directly. Between themselves and the other person, there is always a filter, an invisible screen onto which they project their own psychological content, their ideals, their hopes, their unhealed wounds. And what they believe they see in the other is actually what they themselves have placed there. For an empath, this mechanism reaches a particular intensity, because their ability to feel is so developed, so deep, that it creates a rich inner world, and that richness is projected onto the people they choose to love. They assign them a depth, a sincerity, an emotional capacity that actually belongs to them. They confuse what they perceive with what truly exists. This point is often misunderstood, even by those who recognize themselves in this pattern, because the projection Carl Jung describes isn't just an ordinary mistake in judgment. It's not a lack of intelligence, nor a flaw in perception. It's an unconscious, automatic movement that operates entirely outside of your control. An empath doesn't project because they're naive. They project because their inner life is so intense that it naturally spills over onto whatever they're looking at. And that intensity, we're going to explore how it was formed and why it made you vulnerable to a dynamic you never consciously chose, the role you never wanted to play. There's an archetype that Carl Jung studied extensively, one that deeply shapes the psychology of the empath without them ever being fully aware of it: the savior archetype. It's not a role the empath consciously chooses. It's a role they embody, often from childhood, because they learned early on that their value depended on their ability to be useful, to understand, to fix what was broken around them. Somewhere in their story, the love they received was conditional on their availability, their gentleness, their ability to never be a burden. And that condition became imprinted in their psyche as an internal rule they never thought to question. So, when they encounter someone who is wounded, complex, difficult to love, something activates in them automatically, not out of naivety, out of psychological structure. They perceive the other person's suffering with a level of clarity most people don't have, and that perception triggers a deep need to do something with what they feel, to transform, to heal, to support. Carl Jung referred to this kind of dynamic as archetypal inflation, the moment when someone unconsciously identifies with a figure larger than themselves and begins to act from that place without ever realizing it. They no longer see themselves, they see the role, and the role tells them that leaving would be a betrayal, that doubting would be ungrateful, that their own needs can wait just a little longer. What very few people understand at this stage is that the savior archetype doesn't choose its ground randomly. It activates precisely where the empath's wound is the oldest, where the need to be recognized as indispensable runs the deepest. And that is exactly what explains why the same patterns keep repeating. Not bad luck, an unconscious attraction between two wounds that recognize each other. What you refuse to hear. You knew, not clearly, not in words, but you knew. There was that quiet tension you'd been feeling for weeks, that subtle unease you kept burying under layers of goodwill and rational explanations. Your body was picking up on information your mind refused to process, a hesitation that lasted a little too long, a response that didn't match what you had seen with your own eyes. A silence that had a particular texture, different from any other silence. You felt all of it, and you chose to keep going, not because you were blind, but because seeing would have changed everything. And you weren't ready to change everything yet. Carl Jung wrote that the unconscious is constantly communicating with the conscious mind, but that the conscious has a remarkable ability to ignore what it doesn't want to hear. For an empath, this ability takes on a very specific form. They're so used to feeling other people's pain that they've developed an extraordinary tolerance for emotional discomfort. They know how to absorb. They know how to reframe. They know how to find the explanation that protects the other person rather than themselves. And this skill, which once helped them survive difficult environments, becomes in certain relationships the exact mechanism that prevents them from protecting themselves. But there's something even deeper at play, something Carl Jung identified in his work on the persona, the social mask each of us builds to move through the world. For the empath, this mask takes on a very specific shape, being the understanding one, the patient one, the one who doesn't judge, the one who stays when others leave. And that mask comes with an invisible cost, because to maintain it, the empath has to consistently suppress anything that contradicts it, their anger, their doubts, their boundaries. Every time they felt something was off and chose to stay silent, they didn't just protect the other person, they betrayed themselves. And that repeated, silent betrayal is exactly what made the manipulation possible over time. When the unconscious forces its way in, you remember that moment, not vaguely, precisely. You know exactly where you were, what you were doing, because some realizations imprint themselves in the body before they ever reach the mind. It wasn't an argument, not some dramatic revelation. It was something much quieter, a sentence said absent-mindedly, a look that didn't match the words. A detail so small you could have, once again, chosen not to see it. But this time, something in you didn't follow along. And in that pause, everything you had refused to face for weeks came rushing in all at once, with a clarity you could no longer deny. What you felt wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder, stranger. A sudden emptiness in the exact place where you had poured all your energy and your ability to believe. And in that emptiness, for the first time, you weren't looking for an explanation anymore. You no longer had the strength to build a version of reality that protected the other person. Carl Jung called this moment an encounter with the shadow, not the other person's shadow, but your own. Because when the projection collapses, you don't just discover that the other person lied to you. You discover something harder to face than the betrayal itself, that you actively participated in building that illusion, not consciously, not intentionally. But every time you silenced a doubt, every time you downplayed what you felt to protect the image you had of that relationship, you were feeding a part of yourself you refused to look at. The part that knew something didn't add up. The part that had registered every signal, every inconsistency, every moment when reality didn't match the story you were telling yourself. It never disappeared. It was waiting. And now that it has forced its way through, you can no longer pretend you don't hear it. Carl Jung didn't describe this moment as a collapse. He described it as a necessary disillusionment, in the most literal sense of the word, the end of an illusion. And the end of an illusion, as brutal as it may feel, gives you back something projection had taken from you without you even realizing it: contact with what is real. What that contact will demand from you in practical terms, and why most empaths stop exactly at this threshold, is what we're going to explore next. What you owe to your own psyche. There's a mistake almost all empaths make at this stage, and Carl Jung anticipated it with remarkable clarity. When the manipulation becomes visible, the instinct is to focus all your mental energy on the other person, to understand their motives, to analyze their behavior, to search their past for explanations. It's a way of continuing to look outward, to avoid looking inward. It's a way of staying, despite everything, in the same pattern of projection. And as long as that pattern continues, nothing really changes. The psychological maturity Carl Jung described isn't about absolving the other person. It's not about excusing what happened or minimizing the reality of the manipulation. It's about shifting the question. No longer, why did they do this to me? But what did I learn about myself through what I experienced? What unconscious needs did this relationship feed? What part of me was, without realizing it, drawn to exactly this kind of dynamic? This shift is uncomfortable. It requires a level of honesty most people aren't willing to give themselves. Because it means looking not only at what you went through, but at what you took part in. Not knowingly, not willingly, but still took part in. Carl Jung wrote that as long as an individual doesn't integrate their shadow, they will keep encountering it outside themselves, projected onto others, drawn into their relationships, repeated in their choices. This isn't a curse, it's a mechanism. And like any mechanism, it can be understood and then transformed. The empath who reaches this level of awareness doesn't become cynical. They don't become suspicious or closed off. They become something rarer, something more grounded, someone who withdraws their projections, who stops looking for in others what they haven't yet found within themselves, who begins to distinguish between what they truly feel and what they learn to feel in order to survive. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, is what Carl Jung saw as the real beginning of individuation. Not an elevation, a return to yourself, slow, demanding, and deeply freeing. This return to yourself doesn't look the way you imagine. It isn't bright. It doesn't come with a sense of victory or immediate relief. It feels more like a new kind of silence, slightly uncomfortable at first, because you're no longer used to carrying what belongs to others. Because for a long time, that weight had become a way of existing, and without it, something in you has to learn how to stand differently. Carl Jung observed that when someone begins to withdraw their projections, the external world doesn't change. The questions do. The empath no longer asks what the other person feels before asking themselves. Slowly, they begin to ask what they feel, not out of withdrawal, not out of indifference, but because something has quietly shifted inside them without them needing to force it. What the empath discovers at this stage isn't that they were weak, it's that they were seeing the other person through their own inner lens rather than through reality. And this realization is the only one that makes it possible to stop repeating what just happened, not by distrusting everyone, but by learning to distinguish between what is truly there and what was projected. It's not a guarantee, it's simply a more accurate way of seeing. And a more accurate way of seeing, according to Carl Jung, is the only starting point that truly matters. Now I'd like to ask you two questions. Was there a specific moment when you realized you had projected a version onto someone that didn't really exist? What was the detail, the sentence, the silence that made everything shift? Share your experience in the comments. I always read you carefully.